were twice as likely to be in the top quartile financially against their peers, and 5 times as likely to make decisions more quickly, and 3 times as likely to execute their decisions as intended. So those companies that are actually using that data are getting a significant corporate advantage at the moment. But we are now finding that the public sector is waking up to some of the kind of possibilities of data. So, this is something I think that will filter into your own worlds if it hasn't already. And I mean, what are some of those opportunities that might be there for the public sector? I mean, efficiencies and cost is one obvious area. Can you take cost out of the way that you're delivering healthcare, education, benefits, whatever it might be? Another is around developing and monitoring key performance indicators. How do you know you're making a difference? Is there new data that you can be drawing upon, especially digital data? Monitoring external risks. Are there things that your horizon scanning isn't currently picking up, which you can now pick up through, for example, monitoring Twitter feeds, that kind of thing? And better customer segmentation, so actually understanding who are the people that are using your public services, which ones are the most costly, which ones are the least, what can you do about that, etc. But the thing is, organizations are struggling to get value from their data, and for all sorts of reasons. Some of them lack the skills. There can be organizational silos between different data sets. So local authority data sets might not talk with the NHS data set, which might not talk with the police and crime kind of data sets that we've got. So trying to map what's going on in a region can be quite tricky. Data quality also may not be as good as we want it to be. So there are challenges. But the biggest challenge of all is actually asking good questions. I mean, the thing from the RSS's perspective is that big data sounds very sexy, but actually what people want isn't data, we want answers. And I think this is the opportunity for you as finance professionals, because that's what you're used to thinking about. So I think you're very well placed to translate data into commercial insights for your organizations. And you'd be not doing the data analysis yourself. You'd be working with the data science, the statisticians, the information technologists who can kind of gather, store that data and do some of the analysis. But you can help them think about what are the right questions which will drive public sector service performance, business performance. How does that tie into budgeting, forecasting, performance management, and so on? So, and I think the challenge back to you is to start looking beyond traditional data sets to measure performance, and also to start working with communities that you may not necessarily have a strong relationship with your statisticians or with your data science or your analytics people in your organization, and so how you can build some of those. And I think more broadly, there's an opportunity here for the accountants who want to move beyond being seen as the sort of backroom accountants and the reporting function, to actually taking the front foot to being in the kind of business intelligence analytics function. So are you driving strategy, or are you just reporting back on what happened last year? And I think that's the big opportunity for you. I want to pick up on just 2 or 3 other developments which are happening, which relate to this sort of big data agenda. One is evidence-based policy making, which is a term you can't really get away from at the moment. Austerity in particular has concentrated the minds of policymakers, and there's a recognition that you've got to get value for money, you've got to get bang for your buck. So what are the policies that make the biggest difference? To actually know that, you've got to gather the data, and you've got to both publish data in advance to say this is why we're making certain policy decisions, but also track policy as it goes through and evaluate it in the longer term. The UK is doing some interesting work in this area. 2 initiatives. One is the What Works centres, 5 or 6 centres of excellence looking at different policy agendas and bringing academics and policymakers together to say, what do we know about local economic growth and what actually works and what doesn't work? Or what do we know about living with an ageing population? And academics often know things, but they don't get translated into policy at the right time. So that's quite a useful initiative, I think. The other one, which is quite fascinating, is the use of randomized control trials. And some of you may have come across, we now have a behavioural insights team in the UK based in the Cabinet Office. And what they've been doing is looking at ways in which you can make relatively small changes in public policy delivery, which might have a significant impact. And as an example, one thing that they did was vary the letter that the tax office sent out for those people who were paying late. and just changing some of the wording, for example, to reflect the fact that other people in your area have already paid, led to 90% changes in people making the payment. And they were able to do this in a randomized control trial way, so they could send 50 letters out of one batch, well, 50, I mean, you know, thousands in one, thousands in another, and then compare the response rates. So in these sorts of areas, you can actually get very high-quality feedback as to how policy changes. Now, I mean, this works best in very micro changes. You know, once you get into complex social policy fields, it becomes much more complicated. What's the best intervention to change how you teach maths in schools is more complicated to evaluate. But these tools are being explored by governments at the moment, and I think that, again, there's something for the finance professionals to be able to drive some of these changes and to engage with some of those changes from a kind of performance management perspective. The one caveat I'd add, though, on this is that public perceptions can be quite tricky when it comes to the evidence. So the RSS, did some research earlier this year, and we asked the pollsters Ipsos Mori to look at the areas where public perceptions were out of kilter with the evidence. And just to give you two examples, people thought that teenage pregnancies in the UK were running at 15%. In fact, 0.6% of girls are under the age of 16 are pregnant at any time. So people's perceptions of reality were really out of kilter with the evidence. Another example was the aid budget, the overseas aid budget. 26% of the UK population thought that this was one of the government's 2 or 3 biggest items of expenditure. Now, those of you who will know anything about UK spend will know this is a relatively small, it's about 1% of expenditure. Far more people thought that aid was a big item than pensions, whereas pensions is really one of the big ticket items, as you will all know. So even if you do gather the evidence and the data, actually what the public make of it, there is always a massive communications challenge there. So I think that that's something that we, as the numbers people, have to be aware of, that even though we might know what the evidence tells us, that kind of technocratic vision isn't enough to carry the public, and there's important work to be done to actually ensure that the public understands what the evidence tells us. Two other areas where I just wanted to touch upon before I finish. One was open data. Open data and big data tend to be used in the same breath, but they're slightly different. Big data is talking about just the amount